In the spirit of reconciliation, Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming along to this session of Talking Tours, where we have Dr. Sophie Oosterwijk joining us to talk about the art and architecture of the Low Countries. So, Sophie was born in the Netherlands and has doctorates in art history and English literature. She's very well known for expertise in medieval, Flemish, and Dutch art and culture. She's previously taught art history at the universities of Leicester, Manchester, and St Andrews. She has now been working for many years as a guest lecturer and art tour leader for the University of Cambridge, Arts National, and the National Trust, amongst other organisations. Sophie is multilingual and enjoys travel and leading art tours in Europe, in particular in Belgium and the Netherlands, where she's very much at home. Indeed, she's joining us from the Netherlands this morning. Her lively lectures in person and online are both entertaining and informative and have won her praise from all areas of the world. So thank you very much for coming in bright and early this morning, Sophie.
Not that early, but thank you for inviting me, Nick. It's lovely to be here.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you further, especially about these topics. So just kind of to get a sense, we know that you are born in the Netherlands, and but how did you first become interested in the art of the Low Countries?
Well, you can't but become interested because we're surrounded by museums, and my parents made a point of taking me and my sister around museums. I still remember the first visit to the Rijksmuseum. I wasn't that young because for us, living in the countryside, Amsterdam was the big city. It still feels that way to some extent. And so I must have been about 11. And that was the time when the night watch was being restored after a knife attack. And they also took us to Madame Tussauds. And I'm the only one in the family who still remembers that. But at that time, Madame Tussauds in Amsterdam had displays of Karel Appel, as I say, display kind of a reenactment or something like that. But what really fascinated me was a display of details from the work of Hieronymus Bosch. And there's an 11-year-old absolutely mesmerized and asking my mother, well, what's this about? And she couldn't give me the answer either. So people have found that quite amusing when I told that anecdote. But Bosch certainly mesmerized me, and he's definitely in my top 10 of artists.
Yes. And is there a particular work of his that captivates you? Just
Well, you can't help but say the Garden of Earthly Delights, but for that you have to go to Spain, of course.
it's an interesting story as well. How did the work end up in Spain?
Well, Bosch was greatly collected after his death. It's the Habsburgs. So Philip II, long after Bosch's death, became interested. He, of course, is the most Catholic of kings, and that in itself is proof that Bosch is not the weirdo or heretic or, a member of a secret society that people often think he must have been. He worked in a particular idiom, a very individual fantasy. But for Philip II, it was still within the traditional Orthodox Catholic doctrine, these warnings about the hereafter and against sin. So Philip had works even in his bedroom by Bosch. And yes, he collected them, he had agents, and so the majority of them ended up, sadly for us, in Spain.
Well, it's kind of an interesting work to have, I suppose, in the bedroom. You can't imagine what he would be dreaming.
With Philip II, no, rather not go there.
No, it's probably a good idea. Um, so what eventually kind of led you to take people around the region exploring its arts, its history, and its architecture?
A variety of reasons. It started off way back when I was still a PhD student, and then it was working for a university I shan't name in the Midlands, and these were very cheap tours. Also with the WEA, the Workers' Educational Association, they weren't very well paid, they weren't very well organized. At that time, it gave me a bit of a sour taste. We were put up in cheap hotels without our knowledge. So it took a long time, and then I was approached by another company in London, and I got to experience the other side of art tours, not the cheap ones where you drive around in rickety buses and stay in transit hotels near the airport, but actually the luxury art travel, where you're also respected as a lecturer, not just the one waving a flag with groups that are too large. And that is what I enjoy doing. Yes, for me, there is the luxury of staying in nice hotels and having nice food, but having groups of people who are really interested and sharing my own enthusiasm for places. And the wonderful thing is also when you're going around places, you discover something new every time, simply also because you're seeing them through the eyes of people who've never encountered this before. And that enthusiasm, that sense of discovery, in a way comes back to you and it enthuses you all over again. But yes, it's that sense of shared discovery I like, and also trying to find new places, places I haven't yet seen myself, and thinking that would be great to show people.
And are there places in the Netherlands you've discovered recently that you're kind of keen to show people?
Um, Well, sometimes they're coincidental things because you must remember over 20 years I lived in the UK and I really had to rediscover my own country again when I came back in 2011. And then I went back to St Andrews where I worked for a couple of years. So I've really been permanently settled again in the Netherlands in 2016. And I had a friend then who sadly has since died, but he knew wonderful places where the Romans had been, and not necessarily places I would take people, but he certainly knew his way around. Little country lanes, and sometimes you just turn a corner and there's the remains of a beguinage in Leiden that I never knew was there, for example. I lived in Leiden for many years, so there is still that monuments that you didn't know were there, and sometimes things get moved around as well. But yes, there's still things to be discovered.
Which is amazing. I suppose it points to just how rich the heritage of the region is and just how many
In
layers
such a
of it have
small
survived.
country, yes.
Yes, yes, especially compared to the distances that I suppose most Australians are used to having to travel to get between places, but to have so many, so much, so close together and to still be finding new things is quite extraordinary.
Yes, we have a rich heritage, and that's true of the Netherlands and of Belgium. We combine them as the Low Countries, but you have to be quite specific because in our tour we're going to be focusing on Flanders. But in our tour of the Netherlands, we'll be going outside the part that is technically Holland by staying in Utrecht and going to the east of the country. And not many tours do that.
Yes, there does tend to be that kind of very strong focus on kind of Amsterdam and everything that's in Amsterdam.
Yes.
Although, as we know, is one of those cities that is becoming quite inventive in the ways it has to try and manage the number of people who want to come and visit Amsterdam.
Inventive and restrictive. I think Amsterdam is still a wonderful city. It has lots to offer, but I always recommend people either to stay outside Amsterdam or go to Amsterdam not as part of a group, because that is difficult at times. It's lovely to add on a few days to a tour, book yourself a small family-run hotel, and just go do everything on foot. Because if you have to do it in a tour, in a coach, it's undoable, really. And even walking around in a large group, if I wanted to guide a group around Amsterdam, I would need a special permit, and the size of the group is still very restrictive. So that makes it difficult for me to work in Amsterdam. I love going to the museums there. It's no problem with me guiding people around. But if I wanted to take a group around the city centre, it would be a problem. And getting coaches close to any city centre hotel is virtually impossible these days. So
Yes,
Amsterdam is lovely, but go there on your own or, not as part of a group. That would be my advice.
yes. And I imagine as well, if you've been traveling in the region as part of a group, you've been able to see and learn a lot before you go to Amsterdam. So you'll have all that fresh. in
Yes,
your mind still. Hmm.
yes.
I suppose the other benefit of Amsterdam is it's very, very easy to get anywhere else by rail or air. It's so well
That is the
connected.
thing. Our distances are so short that in the Netherlands we calculate distances usually by bike. If you can't cycle there on a push bike, it's far away. It counts as far away. So my sister lives an hour and 10 minutes away. That's very far by Dutch standards. And I have to say, with the traffic jams can be a problem. But then our railway system, as long as it doesn't snow, but that's unlikely in September, um, our railway system is very good, and you can be in The Hague or Utrecht or Amsterdam or Haarlem or Gouda or Leiden in next to no time, maybe one change, but the rail connections are very good, and it's a short walk from the city, from the station in Amsterdam into the city. You walk out, and you head straight down. So that's good as well.
It is. It is. So when there's across, say, the two countries with their kind of their different heritages, as you point out, the tour focuses on Flanders in the north of Belgium rather than kind of the French-speaking Wallonia in the south, which is very, very different place, very different places.
Absolutely,
In
yes.
incidentally, they each region takes turns over who gets to represent the country in the Venice Biennale because they don't get along very well. So one year you'll get the French side, the other year you'll get the Flemish side, but they don't talk.
Yes, and people don't even realize there's also a German speaking part in Belgium. So it's a trilingual country. And as a Dutch person, I never know which two languages any Belgian is likely to speak. They could be German and Flemish speaking. And Flemish and Dutch are very similar, although it's easier for the Flemish to understand the Dutch than vice versa. But yes, Belgium, it says enough that the king is not the king of Belgium, but the king of the Belgians, plural. That
Yes,
is in itself quite telling. It's a difficult country.
it
And that is
is. It is.
also why staying in Brussels in a way, although it would make sense to start a tour like that. I mean, I always like starting a tour. It's lovely to do the two countries together. Starting in Belgium makes better chronological sense because you start in the 15th century and you have the 16th century with Rubens, and then you move to the north, to the Netherlands, where the 17th century is very much the focus. So you move chronologically up. But Brussels too it's a lovely city in some ways, but it's also a difficult city. It's of course full of EU buildings. For some reasons, also always full of roadworks. There's always problems with roads being closed off. You never know, and signposting is not exactly a Belgian talent. And Belgium isn't, sorry, Brussels isn't Flanders. It's as simple as that. Again, one of these typical Belgian things, but there is a website of Flemish paintings in Flemish collections. The museum in Brussels isn't on that website because Brussels isn't Flemish. So it
Yes.
just says it all. And it's lovely to pay the city a visit. But if it comes to staying somewhere, then a city like Ghent is lovely. Bruges is lovely, but then Bruges has it's difficult because it's so touristic. It's beautiful, but it's also got an element of Disneyland about it. It's
Mm.
finding a supermarket, finding any ordinary shop that isn't a chocolate shop and a lace shop and a gift shop, very difficult. Whereas Ghent is a lovely university city. It's got all the old buildings, it's got museums, and of course, the absolute highlight of the tour, one with which we'll start the Ghent altarpiece, or technically the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, by, I'm afraid to say, my number one favorite artist, Jan van Eyck, and his brother Hubert.
And what draws you to that painting so much? I know it's one of my favorite paintings of all time too. For me, it's about the
Well,
extraordinary
funnily,
display of skill. But what is it for you?
a bit of everything. And I must confess that I came to it quite late because although I said that my parents took me and my sister around museums, Belgium wasn't high on the agenda. And that is also, thank you for that, EU. In my youth, the relations between Flanders and the Netherlands weren't exactly very warm. If I, as a Dutch person, went to Flanders, people would often pretend they didn't understand my Dutch and would speak French to me. That has all changed. It's unfortunate in some ways because the Belgians now hate one another far more than they hate the Dutch, which is curious. The Walloons, as you said, and the Flemish are not exactly seeing eye to eye. But in my youth, it was very much the Flemish against the Dutch. The independence, the War of Independence of 1830, and independence was declared in the kingdom, founded in 1831. But that still rankled very much. And so we didn't go to Belgium very much, which is sad because if I'd gone there in my youth, I might have seen what I recall some people describing with awe, namely that if you were lucky that you could bribe the verger, or there was a group that bribed the verger for you, you could see the altarpiece being opened right in front of you. That
Oh,
is an
wow.
experience we have lost. And I always call that the wow effect because it is so cleverly constructed. It is a triptych or a polyptych technically, but it's got the two wings made up of different panels. And those are relatively plain in color, very sober. But then when it opens, it doubles up in size and you get this technicolor extravaganza of landscapes and figures and so realistically painted. The skill is phenomenal and you stand in front of it and you can't take it in. I often say it's good to have at least some details pointed out to you beforehand in a lecture, and then you know that you can't focus on some of the details because they're too high up. It's an enormous work. And the colors, and since the restoration, I have to say, of course, there have been controversies like the lamb that was changed, and not everyone likes the new lamb. But it's overwhelming. I can't describe it, but overwhelming is the best way. It is sad that you now have to go into a quiet chapel. Now, don't quote me on this, but I know that I'm not supposed to talk in front of it, but I can sit on a chair and whisper. So that is where the whisperers come in very handily. So as long as you're discreet with it, it's fine. Um, but it's it's behind glass and it is apparently opened and closed once a day. It's opened in the morning, all mechanically. It's got a mechanism, but you'd have to be there very, very early in the morning. And I've never, ever been there. And again, they close it late at night. I'm not sure they would even allow people to see that, but that would be wonderful. To have that mystical effect, because that is what it is. This opening up from a very sober exterior to this interior that is absolutely full of color and what seems to be gold, and the illusion of realism, because it is beyond realism, it's a hyper realism. The fact that Van Eyck, and that I find amazing as well, that Van Eyck managed to suggest textiles like these numerous brocade, gold brocade copes and vestments that he couldn't possibly have copied from life because these things were A, scarce, and B, too expensive to be handled by a painter who had his fingers full of oil paint. He couldn't just go to a church and say, "Can I borrow a few chasubles because I need to paint angels wearing gold brocade?" He made it up. And that is what I find so amazing. The crown at the feet of God, the crown worn by the Virgin, even the backdrop, the cloth, it all looks highly realistic, but it's an illusion.
And there's that beautiful way, just thinking of the brocade, the way that he has the pattern of the brocade following kind of all of the kind of the contours of the fabric. Whereas you see some painters would take the easy way out and like just
Oh,
stamp it over the
yes.
top.
Yes, yes. And the great thing is that you get a chance to see that again close up when you go to the Groningen Museum and you see Jan van Eyck's Madonna with Canon van der Pale, which was on the title slide at the very start of this lecture, of this talk. And then you can stand right in front of it and you can see the brocade close up and see how convincing it is. And then there are other comparisons of indeed artists who may have used stencils, and at first it looks totally convincing. But then when you look close up, you see exactly that the pattern of the fabric doesn't follow the fall of the robes and the folds in the garment. So, yes, and then you realize how absolutely brilliant an artist he is.
And it's good. They're, I suppose, they're the kind of the key works that we'll be able to see of his from Ghent, both in Ghent and in Bruges. Are there other works in those cities that you would hold up as um, not necessarily to the same standard as those two works, but as ones that kind of give us interesting insight into the period?
Well, Memling is interesting because in some ways he's much later, he's still 15th century, and he follows into the Eyckian tradition, as it's called. So it's interesting to look at works by other artists, Petrus Christus. Of course, Roger van der Weyden is fantastic as well, but you can see how strong the influence of this hyper-realism is, and also you either get the Van der Weyden wish to go for extreme emotions, um, passion scenes. Van Eyck goes for beauty, for Madonnas in wonderful settings. They're contemplative works, but above all, they are about beauty. And we'll see two of his works in Antwerp as well. But then you see the works of Memling, and he follows very much in that more placid. And I say placid, that's somewhat critical, but indeed, whenever he has to do a passion scene, Memling is not very good at that. He doesn't do martyrdom very convincingly, and he too is about beauty, and it's sometimes, and heaven forbid that I should criticize Memling because he's also a wonderful portrait painter, but there's sometimes something a bit insipid about some of his scenes where passion was clearly the intention, and he doesn't pull it off very well. So you get that, and then that takes you into the 16th century. You still get artists like Gerard David, who technically comes from close to where I live in the Netherlands, but he moves to Bruges as well, and Adrian Isenbrandt, and then you're well into the 16th century, and they're still working within that tradition. And then you get mannerism. And although I have to say, Northern mannerism is not my cup of tea so much, it's interesting to see because these artists do what we would now call the grand tour. They do get a chance either in the entourage of a bishop or some nobleman to go to Italy. They encounter the works of Leonardo and Michelangelo and mannerism in Italy, and they think, oh, that's what we must be painting. And they go back and they're still trained in that tradition of close observation, of nature, of reality. So this warts and all portraiture and this the very naturalistic depiction of fabrics, and then they combine that with um, contorted bodies, the most weird poses, and with someone who is important, Martin von Heemskerk, who's a wonderful portraitist, but
Mm.
you end up with these muscular bodies where the sinews are all showing, and you look up people's nostrils and these exaggerated poses, and you think you shouldn't have tried so hard, but they're trying to almost out-mannerist the mannerists of Italy. And it's a phase they have to get through. It's the 16th century. It's interesting to look at Bruegel, and we'll be seeing works by Bruegel in Brussels, because Bruegel also is part of that same contingent or similar contingent. He spent several years in Italy or en route there and back again, and then comes back to Antwerp and eventually Brussels. And he is very much a northern artist. There are traces of mannerism there, but you'd have to look very hard for them. He is far more, much more into the Bosch tradition, because Bosch too
Mm.
was a pioneer in landscape painting, and also in some ways very late medieval tradition of showing people almost like cartoon figures. They're, dumpy peasants doing funny dances in the fields. The landscapes are wonderful, but there's something, it would be a mistake to call it naive, but that is the first word that often springs to mind. They're very sophisticated paintings, but there is a kind of earthly naivety about them.
reminds me of a wonderful drawing of his of the artist and the
The
potential
connoisseur.
buyer.
Yes,
Exactly.
yes,
Yes. Yes. We're kind
yes,
of
I know. Where the eye of the connoisseur is already diving into his purse, and although we can't see the work on the easel that the artist is working on, he's got this kind of heavenward look of, oh dear, another one of those. It's often thought of as, if not a literal self-portrait, then certainly how Bruegel felt about some of his patrons. It's great
and there's that
work.
kind of that wonderful humor that flows throughout his like with the just thinking of kind of the 100 proverbs and the different ways he comes for illustrating, I suppose, in quite imaginative ways, verbal plays.
Yes, I often call them conversation pieces because I
Hmm.
think that's what they were. They're so full of detail. I mean, people are still debating how many children's games there are in the painting in Berlin or how many proverbs there are in the painting in Vienna. Unfortunately, they're all far away again. But you stand in front of them, and I suspect that after a dinner party, because they're large paintings, they're about nearly 1 meter 70 wide on panel, and you have a dinner party, and then you take your guests to see the painting and say, okay, let's see how many proverbs can you
Yes.
recognize. And I think that's what it's all about, really. It's not just about the beauty of the townscape, because the townscape is snowed under the a number of figures in there and doing things. But it's trying to spot things, and that's also true of the Fall of the Rebel Angels that we'll be seeing in Brussels.
Mm.
That has that same quality, and a whole book has been devoted to just that painting. Um, Again, I can talk a lot about that, but it's another one of these. In some ways, you could call it puzzle painting, and I think Bruegel lends himself very well to jigsaw puzzles because it really forces you to look very closely at his work.
And just thinking, is that a theme of kind of not necessarily the puzzle painting, but that kind of uh, humor and attention to detail? Is that something that would then flow into just thinking of kind of well, thinking of people like Jan Stein and others.
Yes, and you can go a bit earlier because Avrakamp, Hendrik Avrakamp is a good one. Bruegel is pioneer in winter scenes as well. And then you get someone like Avrakamp, who is a Dutch artist, mysterious artist. He may have been a deaf mute. He's known as the Mute of Kampen. And he has a nephew also then becomes a winter landscape painter. They are both, but especially Hendrik Avrakamp, the uncle, specialists in winter landscapes. And I always find them beautiful, but also so funny. You get this very high horizon, very high viewing point, as if you're standing on top of a high tower. You overlook an ice scape, usually a frozen river. And you see, if you start looking closely, there's lots of things going on. First of all, in these winter landscapes, you've got a mingling of the classes. So the upper classes can go on the ice in fancy sledges, horse-drawn sleighs. The lower classes may still be struggling to make a living, carrying firewood or trying to do some fishing. And there are ships stuck in the ice, but it's always someone falling over, preferably showing their bare buttocks or underwear, if it's a woman. And there's usually someone peeing or defecating behind a tree. And that actually goes back to Bruegel. So it's that kind of earthly humor, and it's a kind of spot the man peeing. And then there's these tiny little details, and you think, oh, they're having fun here. And this is clearly what you also see in other ways with Jan van Eyck, the showing off, see what I can do, see how clever I am. I think that that is really an aspect of it, of see how clever I can do this or that, or those little details. And you get that with Averkamp, and then, of course, with Jan Steen, as you say. The details are a bit more in your face, but it really is a case of how many proverbs, how many, hints, nudge, nudge, wink, wink can you find in one painting? And makes an interesting contrast with Vermeer because they are near contemporaries. They're 6 years or so apart. Jan Steen is slightly older. Jan Steen is a Catholic. Vermeer marries a Catholic. Both of them die young. Vermeer in his 40s, Jan Steen in his 50s. Both have large families and struggling financially. But Vermeer has a very small oeuvre, is a meticulous painter. Jan Steen churns them out. His better works are clearly more sophisticated, but some 400 works have been attributed to him, which is 10 times more, over 10 times more than with Vermeer. And I always say they are antitheses because Vermeer leaves you guessing. It's all very understated. It's rare in his work. There are a few works that you think, wait a minute, there's something going on. The Procuress in Dresden is a good example. There you know it's definitely about sex. In other places, you think, well, maybe she just wanted a drink. And then you have to say, well, yes, but it's a man who's actually waiting to fill up her glass again. There's more going on here. At least that's being implied. Whereas with Jan Steen, if he has a seduction scene, he hammers it in. Vermeer leaves you guessing. Jan Steen, well, if he can tell a story with five, hints, he'll probably use 10. He's a bit like Hogarth in the 18th century, really full of details. And they make you laugh. He's supposed to be a moralist, but you think you can be a moralist and have fun with it. And that's true, of course, of Hogarth as well, very often, not in all his work, but often.
Yes, and it's thinking kind of it's kind of following this kind of chronological move through kind of into Netherlandish painting or into Dutch painting, and into the 17th century. So kind of there are plenty of paintings to see in and around The Hague with kind of its exceptional collections, as well as in the Rijksmuseum. But I'm enjoying how kind of we're actually being able to move from the paintings and the art history into that kind of broader culture that they're coming from. So just
Well, that is
and
where town walks are wonderful. And I already mentioned that a town walk in Amsterdam is difficult. You need a professional guide. And actually, having seen smaller places, you may want to add a few days in Amsterdam by yourselves and then explore for yourself because that's not at all difficult. But when you go to places like Gouda and Leiden, especially, or Delft and Dordrecht. There are plenty of lovely places in all over the Netherlands, to be honest. Then you encounter the 17th century, because that is very much the period where the Golden Age, we can't use that term anymore technically, but when Dutch trade flourished, of course, it's our colonial past as well, which we're not happy about these days, but it made people rich. They build canal houses. It's still the case that land is at a premium, whereas tiny countries, so people build tall houses, narrow houses, and deep plots with deep gardens behind. You have to let in the light through the front and the back of the house because they're terrace houses technically. They're all, stacked together, so you have no side light. So you have to make the best of the tall windows at the front and the back of the houses. And you get, light is unlike in Italy, where it's plentiful. We're a much more northern country, not quite as northern as Sweden, but even so, in winters it can be dark. So light is clearly important. And going around, going for a town walk, you see that. But then, for example, if you go to Utrecht, a lovely city, by the way, and again, one that tours usually skip. I love Utrecht. The Rietveld Schroeder House is very much about light and about making the best of small spaces. It's a very modern design. Well, we're talking early 20th century. Mr. Rietveld, the famous architect, created this house for Mrs. Schroeder, a widow who had been living in one of these very tall but 19th century houses, and she wanted something different. And the result is absolutely striking. Um, so again, and we'll combine that part of the tour. with a visit to Het Loo, the royal palace from the 17th century. So you again get the same idea again that you get with the canal houses, tall windows, making the most of the light, but in a palatial setting, in a large garden, which has all been carefully restored and in nice weather. You can never count on that. That's the disadvantage of going north. But in nice weather, the gardens are lovely to walk around in. And then you also get the sculpture park and the Kröller Museum. And again, a lot of people have asked me on tours of how easy is it to get to the Kröller Museum. It isn't easy. I would have to take the car there. You need a coach. If you want to do it by public transport, it can be done, and we have a very good app to show you how to travel and which bus to take, but it's numerous trains and buses. And um, so to go there, it's a fabulous building. And the curious thing is, the building was meant to be a temporary building, full of light, all one story, to house the collection of Mrs. Kröller-Müller, again, a woman who is the patron behind it all. She's been advised to buy Van Gogh. So it's the second largest Van Gogh collection in the world, but also contemporary painters. So you get the Impressionists, but also a wonderful mobile by Calder. There's modern art, there's a sculpture garden. And it's a large, because that was also part of the bequest to the Dutch nation, it's a large landscape park with a 1930s architect designed hunting lodge, and that too is a wonderful place, where the museum is about light, where you get to see the other Van Gogh collection, not the one in Amsterdam. You can go and visit on your own because no one is allowed to guide in the Van Gogh Museum in any case. So again, that is a museum people can do on their own. But in the Kröller Museum, it's a wonderful, wonderful collection, and it's a shame in some ways that it's so far out, because that is a
Yeah.
reason for staying in Utrecht. You are at least some way there. Combining that visit, Hadlow, and the Kröller Museum means a long day out, but it's doable. Whereas if you're staying in Amsterdam, it's just, despite this being a small country, the traffic can be
Yes.
off-putting, to put it mildly.
Yes, you look at it on a map and think, oh, in Australian eyes, it's just around the corner. But then there's the difficulty, the length of time it takes to get out, and then having to navigate and find your way to both of those places. And
Yes.
they are exceptional. Um, so we mentioned kind of using Utrecht as a base, and the Rietveld Schroeder house. That there's kind of drawing on these, I suppose, different aspects of the history of the Netherlands as well as its architecture. Um, and just that when putting together the itinerary, there are some things in Rotterdam that you're kind of very much wanting to show people, because some of them are, again, people pass through, or they pass, you drive around Rotterdam and to see all the trucks going out to the port, but no, don't head into the city centre and see what there is.
Rotterdam, of course, is a prime opportunity. I recently saw a video with a reconstruction of what Rotterdam was like before the war, and it was a handsome city with aspects that made me think, oh, that's like Leiden, oh, that's like that part of Amsterdam. Canal houses, canals, a fair number of 17th century parts of the city, a kind of shopping arcade that reminded me of the ones in Adelaide, but also the one in The Hague, just around the corner from the hotel we'll be staying at. And of course, it was all bombed to smithereens in the early days
Mm.
of, well, the war on Holland. And my mother lived outside Rotterdam and remembered seeing the flames on the horizon. It traumatized the Netherlands. It led to the capitulation. The bombing should probably never have happened because the Dutch had already capitulated, but the message didn't come through, and so Rotterdam was bombed anyway. It's a loss, and certainly also a loss of life, but it was also a wonderful opportunity because, of course, in Amsterdam you have that problem of you have to keep the city centre intact, and so the high-rise buildings are all outside the city, virtually all. But in Rotterdam, the architects had that opportunity of going really, really modern. And so there are wonderful modern buildings there. And the cube houses, they're not just in Rotterdam. There is one other city where they are. Well, I personally think they're mad. I don't think I'd want to live in one. But as an the whole area of these cube houses and what is known as the pencil, this tower block that looks like an upright pencil, and then the Markthal with its amazing space and the apartments inside, and then all the eating places and shops underneath the arch, because it's basically a huge arch. It's exciting architecture, and I'm not an architectural specialist, but it is fun to take people around cube houses. One of them you can visit, it's permanently open as a museum house, and all you can do when you go inside is think, yes, is this practical? How could anyone think this would be a good idea? But they're very popular, and as I said, two of these areas are still there. And it was very much part of 1970s thinking about making houses. Well, then they were supposed to be affordable, to create little social communities where neighbors would encounter one another. There'd be interaction on the stairs. What you do with your bike is beyond me, I have to say, with all those steps going up and down. Great to keep fit, definitely. But that was the philosophy behind it. There was very clearly, and the bombardment in Rotterdam and the gradual rebuilding, because you can imagine that originally it was a case of building just about anything, and then gradually they had to house the people who had been left homeless. But then there are further renovations of the city. And yes, it is an interesting area and the philosophy behind it. As with the Rietveld Schroeder house in Utrecht, the philosophy of how you want to live, how you want to make the best of space, how you want to create a community, make it friendly to its environment. And of course, sometimes things have changed. The Rietveld Schroeder house was originally on the outskirts of Utrecht and had a view of the countryside. And of course, now it's been swamped. There is a major motorway running, almost next door to it, although you can't quite see it, but it's certainly there. So things have changed, but the philosophy behind that, and also, again, you have that with the canal houses, people in the 17th century who lived in the inner city, also, if they could afford it, would have a house in the country. So there's that city country feel. Even for me, I live in the country, although if I look out of my window, I see houses everywhere. But Amsterdam still feels like the big city. And so you're a country girl, you're a city girl, or man, boy. And that for such a small country is still there. We don't have as much countryside as we would like. In fact, a lot of what we call countryside is meadows, pastures, agriculture. And there's a big debate about that with carbon footprint and all that. But we are aware of the fact that green is important. And even in the 17th century, the canals were not just there as open sewers and means of transport. They planted trees alongside the canals because that gave you a bit of a country feel and also provided shadow. And so even in the 17th century, people were aware of creating living spaces that were agreeable.
And that's an interesting connection to draw, kind of I suppose, in terms of not just the architectural history and what lies behind that, but I suppose some of the social history and the philosophy around community making, and how that informs urban design and kind of, yeah, even planting street trees in the 17th century. It's sort of something that kind of is neglected in contemporary Australian urban development. It's like, where do you put the tree? Yeah.
Yes, and what kind of tree?
Yes, yes, yeah. Yeah. So just thinking, um, ooh, I suppose, hmm, when there's so much to see, and across, I suppose, that tour that's really focusing on from the 15th century to the 20th century, both in terms of the art, but also the history that lies behind behind the art, the culture, which is, as you're pointing to here, is part of a continuous living culture as well. We're not just walking around museums. It's kind of when we're in the city, we're actually seeing kind of how the what we see in the museum relates to what we're seeing around us, especially in some of those smaller places we visit. Um, is there, just thinking with all of this, is there, I'm just wondering kind of what would you most like people on the tour to take away?
Well, first of all, often I ask people at the start of a tour if they've ever been to the Netherlands and Belgium before. And most of the time, the answer is no, or I passed through Amsterdam en route to somewhere else. Most people either tend to leave the two countries as well when I've done Spain and France and Italy, maybe. And I think the important thing is that that also makes it a voyage of discovery, of realizing that it's not just about paintings that you may have seen in exhibitions already or in art books, but they're part of that culture and that you will understand them a lot better by visiting the countries and seeing where these works of art came from. So that is very important. And for that way, in that way, you go to Italy and you more or less know what to expect. You know the food as well, you know what people eat and drink, you know your Italian wines or your French wines. But because they're such small countries, there's a huge variety in the cities and in even between the two countries. Belgium has a wonderful eating culture, the Netherlands too, but it's different. And I think that if you don't know a country, then there is that element of surprise and let it surprise you because I've never heard people say, I wish I'd gone to France or Italy instead. Most of the time, it's a kind of, it's opened up people's eyes. And that is the lovely thing that I don't want to say challenging people's preconceived notions, but showing that these countries are worth visiting, that you may have left them to one side because, hey, there is so much to see in Spain and Italy and France. And that's absolutely true. And often there is that idea as well of, well, they're such tiny countries, you can see it all in a week. I think that when you do even 12 days in these two small countries, you realize that although you've seen some things reasonably thoroughly, there is still so much more. And who knows, for some people, it may be a taster to come back again or add a few days. And I'm always happy to offer advice if people want to spend a few days before a tour in Brussels. I'd be happy to advise about. Restaurants and places to visit. And the same, this tour is wonderful to add on a few days in Amsterdam. The distances are easy. Stay in Haarlem, another lovely city, and just take what you've had and do it at your own pace as well, because I know the tours are so intensive and people often say, I need a holiday after that. Well, maybe allow yourself a few days after a tour and do a bit more exploration at your own pace and take even more away, because that's the thing that I can choose which places I would like to visit, but it's also often to do with feasibility. Is it doable within the time frame? You have to make choices. There's so much more, and that is the thing. And I'm always happy to advise people.
And I could imagine as well, it's all, I know that once you've spent the time in these places with you and kind of having that kind of that additional knowledge, that insight, the things that you've got a handle on, or kind of those things that might seem strange, that now you understand why. That kind of when you do spend more time there independently, you've still got all of that knowledge with you to help kind of to help see more after the
Yes,
tour as well.
yes.
Well, thank you very, very much for your time this morning, Sophie. I could have, would love to keep talking to you, especially about the about some of the art and the history, because I think we've got some common interests there. But again, thank you very much for kind of for being available and for kind of sharing just a small part of your insight into these fantastic countries and their history, and that there's much more than just Rembrandt's, Vermeer's, and that whole long list of artists that we'll definitely see in the galleries, but it's understanding that kind of the history and the culture that are part of those as well.
Yes. Well, it's been a pleasure, and I hope it will inspire people to come and visit these two countries. So who knows? Thank you very much for allowing me to speak a bit more about my passions about art of my home country and the one next door.
Yes. Okay. Well, if anybody has any questions or thoughts, uh, please feel free to email them through to us at info at, or if there's a particular thing you want to know more about, if you email us through, we can pass that on to Sophie to give you a hand with your planning. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along.